was a week ago Wednesday that I woke up with no voice. Have you ever had that where you don't even have a whisper, you just have a... And lip readers, this is their day. Like, they are just like, oh, I got this. Like, or if you know sign, like if you know ASL, you're just like suddenly going for it, you're okay. But that is not the case for most of us. And I was just hoping I had a sermon ready and prepared and excited to preach Sabbath, and I was hoping that my condition would change and that my voice would return. But sadly, it did not. But Wednesday night was the strangest committee meeting of my life as I typed out everything. And Pastor Gastra, shout out to Pastor Gatra, he read everything so that we could still have our meeting. And then Pastor Mike, as you know, shared a beautiful message on Sabbath. And my voice returned, but there was this silence. One of our church leaders texted me that day as I was talking about waking up with no voice. And she said, here's the lesson our kids are studying this week. And it was a picture, a screenshot of Zechariah with no voice. What are the odds that I wake up with no voice the week? And I saw Josiah studying it later that night. And he's reading about Zechariah with no voice. And that's the week that I wake up with no voice. As we were studying this story, it spoke to me. Silence is an interesting experience, to want to speak and yet have no words cooperating with your desires. Let me tell you, parenting is much harder when you're writing everything out. And especially if you're writing everything out for the older sibling to read to the younger sibling and expecting that that will somehow work. Have you ever experienced silence? Have you ever experienced a period of prolonged silence? What about the silence of God? Have you ever felt as if God were silent? Zechariah himself was one of many priests, and because of that, they lived outside Jerusalem, and then they cast lots and had each their opportunity for when they would participate in certain elements of the priestly duties. And so Zechariah came to the appointed time when it was his role to participate in this way. This opportunity of a lifetime for him to go into the temple and to serve before the Lord. Zechariah was a part of the people of God, the children of Israel, who were used to hearing from God. They had prophets, they had messages, they had a word from the Lord. And yet, if you remember your history between the Old Testament and the New Testament, there is a period of silence. 400 years. No prophets, no messages, no word from the Lord. And Zechariah and Elizabeth felt this personally, because to have a life without children in that time was that you were under the displeasure of God. And yet the scripture tells us that both of them were blameless in the sight of the Lord. But they wondered, and others too, how could it be that God would not bless them with a child? Year after year, their situation remained the same, and they didn't hear anything from the Lord. Now, Zechariah is on duty, and he's going into the temple, and there he is confronted with a surprise, an angel. An angel there declaring that the silence of God is broken, that God is now speaking into the lives of the people. And how will these things happen? He starts to unfold the story, but Zechariah, instead of like, yes, let's do this, he says, how can I be sure of it? Gabriel says, here's your sign. Your own silence will be a sign that the silence of God is broken, that God has indeed heard the people and is coming to them. Your son will be part of the story. John will be anointed from the womb and will have Elijah-like power to prepare the way for Jesus. The angel leaves, and Zechariah departs the temple in silence. The sure sign that God is at work is that he can say nothing. Have you ever thought about those 9 months where God's priest has no voice? For 9 months. As I sat in silence for a mere days, I reflected on God's work this past year. And do you ever find yourself reflecting on this weird period like COVID, this period of time? These last 2 years have been different ones. And I found myself reflecting on the moving of the Spirit, the goodness of God, the faithfulness that I've seen. And so many stories from your own life that you've shared have come to my mind. And I found myself filled with joy. Sometimes we just need a little silence to catch up with our experiences. Do you ever live forward and then have to reflect back and catch up with what God has been doing? I can imagine Zechariah doing something similar. For us who quickly speak, for us who rush in or process out loud, silence brings a deep opportunity to notice, to see what we could have missed, to listen to a word from the Lord. I don't know what God shared with Zechariah during those 9 months, but here's what we do know, that when the baby is born, words can't contain his joy, because his silence births a song. He bursts out into singing. He lifts up his voice in praise. Luke 1:64 says, immediately his mouth was opened and his tongue was loosed, and he began to speak, praising God. And the title over this section in your scripture in Luke 1:67 through 68 through 80 is Zechariah's song. And Zechariah speaks and sings of these beautiful themes: salvation, forgiveness, tender mercy, guidance, shining light. It's remarkable if you read his words. Joy pours out from his heart, and the silence is broken. Can you imagine the experience of the people around there? In some ways, some of us sitting here today might still be waking up from our own periods of silence. You might still be experiencing that in your own life. COVID was a period of silence when this sanctuary was still, and we walked through as pastors and prayed for empty pews. For others, you find yourself still in that space. Maybe you haven't left it. Reflect and hear the word of the Lord in that place. But in the big story of God, of which our lives are a small part, the silence of God, my friends, has been broken. God has come. God didn't stand far off, but God came near, incarnate in flesh, coming close to us. God with us. God with us, friends. God with us. So I invite you to praise. As our youth leaders are going to lead us in a praise anthem to God, you too, like Zechariah, can join your voice. Because when we realize this reality, that God is speaking to us, that God is with us, words aren't enough for us either. Just like Zechariah, we have to burst into song and experience the joy.
I'm Pastor Tara VinCross, and we're so glad that you've tuned into our Azure Hills Church YouTube channel. Please like and subscribe, and click on the bell so that you'll be notified every time we share new videos. We are so glad that you're here. Until next time, please know that we're praying for you as you continue to be a voice of hope.